What you're about to hear is a true story. The sound of a grave being violated is not what you expect. It is not the gothic screech of rusty hinges or the howl of a wolf against a full moon. In the frozen alkali soil of the Salt Lake Valley in the dead of January 1862, it was a dull, rhythmic thud. It was the sound of a spade biting into earth that had already been turned. The dirt was still loose. It lacked the structural integrity of the undisturbed ground. The man in the hole worked with the efficiency of a machine. He did not rush. Panic is the enemy of the professional, and Jean-Baptiste was, if nothing else, a professional. He stood waist-deep in the grave of a stranger. His breath plumed in the sub-zero air. It mixed with the faint, sweet-sick odor of decay that the cold could dampen, but never fully erase. He wasn't looking for gold teeth or wedding rings. The traditional trophies of the resurrection men who supplied medical schools in London or New York. Baptiste's desires were more domestic, more intimate. He leveraged the lid of the pine box open. The wood groaned, a sharp report that vanished instantly into the vast silence of the Wasatch foothills. Inside lay a woman. Her face was pale and waxy in the starlight. She was dressed in the pristine white robes of the priesthood. To the faithful of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, these were not merely clothes. They were the keys to the celestial kingdom, the sacred vestments required to pass the sentinels of the afterlife and rise in the first resurrection. To Jean-Baptiste, they were inventory. With a detachment that bordered on surgical, he maneuvered the body. He did not treat it as a person. He treated it as a mannequin that was proving difficult to undress. He stripped the robes from the stiffening limbs. He folded the linen carefully as he went. He smoothed out the wrinkles against his own thigh. He took the stockings. He took the apron. He took the slippers. When he was finished, he rolled the naked woman back into the raw wood of the coffin. She lay face down now, a final indignity in a night of violations. He closed the lid. He shoveled the dirt back in. He patted the mound smooth, mimicking the care of a grieving family. He walked home under the cover of darkness, a bundle of holy garments under his arm. He looked for all the world like a washerwoman returning from a late shift. He did not feel guilt. He did not feel fear. He felt the satisfaction of a man who had successfully harvested a crop that no one else was willing to reap. To understand the horror of what was about to unfold, you must understand the stage upon which it played out. Salt Lake City in 1862 was not merely a frontier town. It was a theocracy under siege. The United States was tearing itself apart in the Civil War to the east. But in the territory of Utah, the war was spiritual. This was desolate, a place carved out of the high desert by people who had been hunted, shot at, and driven from state to state until they found a place so inhospitable they believed no one else would want it. The isolation was the point. The mountains were the walls of their fortress. The psychological climate of the city was one of intense, almost frantic piety. Death was a constant companion. Cholera, winter exposure, childbirth. They took their tithe regularly, but it was managed through ritual. The body was a temple, even in death. The burial clothes were the final armor a saint wore to meet their God. To disturb a grave in San Francisco or Dodge City was a property crime. To disturb a grave in Salt Lake City was an act of spiritual terrorism. And yet, the city was growing. It was becoming a crossroads. The overland stage brought mail and strangers. The isolation was cracking. In the center of this insular world lived Jean-Baptiste. He was a cipher, a man with no past that anyone could verify. Census records from 1860 listed him as roughly 49 years old, possibly born in Venice, Italy. though he had drifted through the brutal penal colonies of Australia before arriving in Zion. He was a small man, with a face that seemed to slide off the memory. He lived with his wife in a modest home. He attended church. He nodded to neighbors. And he worked the most invisible job in the city, the gravedigger. He was the perfect predator because he was the one man explicitly invited to be there. He was the custodian of the dead. The fox had not just entered the hen house. The fox had been hired to build the coop. The thread that would unravel John Baptiste's macabre tapestry was pulled by a man named Moroni Clausen. Clausen was not a saint. He was a rough-edged outlaw, a man who lived fast and found himself on the wrong side of the law in a territory that didn't tolerate gray areas. In January 1862, Clausen was involved in the robbery and assault of Governor John Dawson, a scandal that rocked the territory. He was arrested. But the stone walls of the penitentiary couldn't hold him. On January 17th, Clausen made a break for it. It was a desperate, doomed attempt. He was gunned down by a police officer in a bloody confrontation that left no room for negotiation. He had no grieving widow, no weeping mother to claim his body. In the eyes of the state, he was refuse. He was destined for a pauper's grave, a pine box, and oblivion. Enter Officer Henry Heath. Heath is the emotional anchor of this story. He was a Salt Lake City police officer, a man hardened by the violence of the frontier, but not stripped of his humanity. He had been part of the manhunt. But when he looked down at the bullet-riddled body of Clausen, he didn't see a monster. He saw a waste of life. But there was something else driving Heath, a shadow behind his eyes. He was a grieving father. He had recently buried his own beloved daughter, Sarah, in the same cemetery where Baptiste worked. The grief was still a raw, open wound. Perhaps it was this proximity to death that made Heath act with uncharacteristic tenderness toward the dead outlaw. Heath couldn't bear the thought of Clausen being dumped into the ground, naked and forgotten. In a gesture of profound charity, Heath reached into his own pocket, a policeman's meager salary. He purchased a decent burial suit for the outlaw. He wanted the man to have dignity. He wanted the boy to go into the dark clothed. He hired Jean-Baptiste to dig the grave. He handed the suit to the gravedigger. He watched the earth cover the box. It was done. A good deed in a weary world. The universe, however, has a way of exposing secrets through coincidence. Days after the burial, a man named George Clausen arrived in the city. He was Moroni's brother. He hadn't been there for the shooting, or the death, or the funeral. But the pull of blood is strong. He was distraught that his brother had been buried in the stranger's grounds, the section of the cemetery reserved for transients and criminals. George wanted his brother moved. He wanted him in the family plot, sanctified and surrounded by kin. He secured the necessary exhumation order and hired a team to bring his brother back up to the surface. Henry Heath, hearing of this, felt a protective instinct. He had paid for that burial. He had a stake in it. He accompanied George to the graveside to oversee the transfer. The day was bitter cold. The breath of the diggers came in short, sharp bursts as they shoveled away the dirt that was still fresh. The sound of the spade hitting the wood echoed again. Thud. They hauled the coffin up. The wood was damp, stained with the soil of the high desert. George Clausen stood by. He braced himself to see the face of his dead brother one last time. The lid was pried loose. The shock that hit Henry Heath was physical. It wasn't the decomposition that stopped his heart. He was a policeman. He knew what death looked like. It was the nakedness. Clausen lay face down in the coffin. He was stark naked. The suit was gone. The suit Heath had paid for with his own money. The suit he had bought to buy a little dignity for a dead man. The body was dirty, smeared with the earth of the grave, tossed back in like a bag of trash. At that moment, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to a razor-sharp realization. This wasn't a mistake. Clothes don't dissolve in a week. Heath looked at the body. Then he looked at the cemetery around him, the hundreds of mounds, the silent monuments. His eyes drifted to the small grave of his own daughter, Sarah, lying just a few rows away. A coldness, deeper than the January air, settled into his bones. If they had done this to a criminal, what had they done to the innocent? Heath didn't scream. He didn't draw his weapon. He turned to the sexton. His voice trembled with a rage that was all the more terrifying for its quietness. "Get the gravedigger," he said. "Get Jean-Baptiste." The walk from the cemetery to the home of Jean-Baptiste was short, but for Officer Henry Heath, it must have felt like a march to the gallows. He was not just a lawman pursuing a suspect. He was a father walking toward the potential desecration of his own child. He was accompanied by the city sexton, J.C. Little, and a handful of deputies. They moved with the grim determination of a storm front. The sun was high now. The winter light was harsh and unforgiving. It exposed the grime of the city streets. They weren't kicking down doors. Not yet. This was still, technically, an inquiry. Baptiste's home was a modest structure, typical of the adobe and timber constructions of the era. It sat quiet, unassuming. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. To the passerby, it was a tableau of domestic tranquility. When they entered, the warmth of the house hit them first. A stifling, humid heat that carried a peculiar scent. It wasn't the smell of cooking or wood smoke. It was the smell of damp earth, wet wool, and something sweeter, something cloying. It was the smell of a root cellar gone bad. Jean-Baptiste was there. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. He stood in the center of his living quarters. His demeanor was eerily calm, like a servant waiting for instructions. His wife was present as well. A woman described in later reports as simple-minded, perhaps unaware of the enormity of the sin she was living in, or perhaps willfully blind to it. Heath didn't waste time with pleasantries. His eyes swept the room. It was cluttered. Too cluttered for a man of Baptiste's means. There were boxes stacked against the walls, wooden crates, piles of fabric covered with sheets. "We know about Clausen," Heath said. His voice was tight. Baptiste didn't deny it. He didn't crumble. He simply watched them. His eyes were dark and unreadable. Heath stepped forward and threw the lid off the nearest crate. The thicket of evidence that greeted them was not a smoking gun. It was a landslide. The box was packed tight with clothes. But these weren't the rough-spun woolens of a pioneer wardrobe. They were white, linen robes, embroidered aprons, sashes, caps. They were burial clothes. Heath pulled a garment out. It was stained with the telltale yellow clay of the cemetery. The hem was stiff with dried mud. He dropped it and opened another box. More robes. He opened a trunk at the foot of the bed. It was filled to the brim. The sensory overload was immediate and nauseating. The sheer scale of the operation defied logic. This wasn't petty theft. This was industrial. But it was the shoes that broke them. In a corner, stacked with a meticulous, almost obsessive care, were the shoes. Dozens of pairs. Men's heavy work boots, women's delicate slippers. And then, the children's shoes. 60 pairs of children's shoes. They were tiny, some were barely worn. The leather still retained the shape of the small feet that had last warmed them. They were lined up in rows. A silent, ghostly infantry. The psychological impact on the officers was devastating. These weren't just commodities. They were mementos. Each pair represented a grieving mother who had tied those laces for the last time, weeping over a small coffin. Baptiste hadn't just stolen leather. He had stolen the final act of parental love. Heath looked at the stove. The fire was roaring. It was fed by wood that looked splintered and varnished. He realized, with a lurch of his stomach, that Baptiste was heating his home with the wood of smashed coffins. The very air they were breathing was thick with the smoke of desecration. Then, The final horror. Heath looked at Baptiste's wife. She was wearing a dress that looked too fine for her station. The fabric was intricate. The fit was slightly off. He realized she was wearing the dead. Baptiste himself was wearing a shirt that had likely been stripped from a corpse days earlier. They were clothed in the stolen shrouds of their neighbors. The professional distance Henry Heath had maintained evaporated. The invisible host of the law vanished. It was replaced by the primal rage of a father. He lunged across the room. He grabbed Jean-Baptiste by the throat. His fingers dug into the man's windpipe. He slammed him back against the wall. The piles of stolen clothes toppled around them, a soft avalanche of white linen. The gun in his other hand was shaking. "My daughter! Did you dig her up?" Heath choked out. This was the pivot point, the moment where the investigation became a personal crusade. Heath had his service revolver drawn. He later admitted that he was fully prepared to execute Baptiste right there in the living room if the answer was yes. Baptiste gasped for air. His face turned purple. He looked into the eyes of the man who held his life in his hands. "No," Baptiste croaked. "Not her." It was a lie? A truth? A mercy we will never know. But in that moment, Baptiste navigated the interrogation with a psychopath's instinct for survival. Perhaps he sensed the proximity of his own death. He confessed to everything else. Clausen, the others, the hundreds of graves. But he carved out an exemption for the man with the gun. Heath threw him to the floor. "Show me," he commanded. What followed was a macabre tour of the Salt Lake City cemetery. Baptiste was dragged back to the scene of his crimes. Under heavy guard, with a growing crowd of horrified citizens watching from the perimeter, he walked the rows and he pointed. "That one." He took a few steps. "That one." He pointed to a fresh mound. "And that one." He didn't need a map. The geography of the dead was etched into his mind. He claimed he had robbed over 300 graves. He had been doing it for years. He had developed a technique. Dig at the head of the grave. Break the coffin lid. Drag the body out just enough to strip it. Then shove it back in. He called it fishing. The math was staggering. 300 graves meant 300 families. The news spread through Salt Lake City like a virus. The golden thread of the community, their shared faith, their shared grief, snapped. The police station was soon besieged. Mobs gathered, armed with ropes and guns. They didn't want a trial. They wanted blood. They wanted to tear Jean-Baptiste apart with their bare hands, just as he had torn apart the sanctity of their loved one's rest. Inside the jail, Baptiste sat in his cell, isolated even from the other criminals who spat at him through the bars. He was a pariah among pariahs. And in the evidence room, Henry Heath sat alone with the 60 pairs of children's shoes. The silence of the room was heavier than any scream. It was a monument to a profound and baffling evil. Why keep the shoes? He couldn't sell them. They were too recognizable. Why hoard them? The answer lay in the psychology of the abyss. Baptiste wasn't stealing for profit alone. He was collecting. He was building a kingdom of things, a fortress of dead objects to fill the silence of his own empty life. The system had failed. The sanctity of the grave was a lie. And as night fell over Salt Lake City, every family looked toward the cemetery and wondered, is my mother still sleeping? Or is she cold? The air outside the Salt Lake City jail was electric, with the specific, terrifying energy of a lynch mob. This was not a crowd of drunks or ruffians. This was a gathering of the faithful. These were fathers who had buried sons, husbands who had buried wives. They stood in the slush of late winter. Their breath was steaming. They clutched rifles and ropes, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had turned their sacred cemetery into a strip mine. Inside, the authorities were in a bind. In any other territory, Jean-Baptiste would have been hanged by morning. But Utah was a theocracy. The final word did not belong to the judge or the sheriff. It belonged to the prophet, Brigham Young. Young's dilemma was theological as much as it was judicial. To execute Baptiste would be to give him a quick exit, a release from the earthly hell he had created. To imprison him for life would be a burden on the saints he had violated. And there was a darker fear. If Baptiste were kept in the city, the mob would eventually get to him. The violence that would follow would stain the hands of the community. Young took to the pulpit. His words were not of forgiveness. They were of a calculated, Old Testament severity. He spoke to the terror of the people regarding the resurrection. He assured them that the missing clothes would not bar their loved ones from the afterlife, that God could reclothe the naked spirits. But for Baptiste, he devised a punishment that was medieval in its creativity. To hang a man for such a deed would not begin to satisfy my feelings, Young declared. Instead, he proposed a fate that would erase Baptiste from the world of men without technically killing him. Exile. Not to a foreign country, but to a geography of nothingness. He was to be cast out, like the scapegoat of ancient Israel, into the wilderness. But in the high desert, the wilderness wasn't just sand. It was salt water. The operation was conducted under the cloak of night. To move Baptiste in daylight would have been to invite a massacre. Officer Heath, likely still seething with the memory of the children's shoes, helped coordinate the transfer. They loaded Baptiste into a wagon. The legend says he was branded before he left, tattooed across the forehead with the words, "Grave robber," or "for robbing the dead." Whether this was ink or scar tissue or merely a metaphor that hardened into fact over the years matters little. The mark was already on his soul. They drove him north, away from the city lights, toward the marshy shores of the Great Salt Lake. The lake in winter is a formidable beast. It is heavy, metallic, silent, but it is cold enough to kill a man in minutes. They transferred him to a boat. The oars cut through the black water. They rowed him first to Antelope Island, the largest landmass in the lake. But the water between Antelope and the mainland was shallow. A desperate man could wade it. They put him back in the boat and rowed deeper, into the center of the inland sea. Their destination was Fremont Island, known then as Miller's Island. It was a triangular wedge of rock and sagebrush, isolated by deep, treacherous channels. It was a place where the horizon offered no hope. Fremont Island is beautiful in the way a skull is beautiful, stark, clean, and utterly devoid of softness. There were no trees, only scrub. There was no fresh water save for what could be scavenged. The Miller brothers, who used the island to graze cattle, had built a small shack there. It was a rude shelter, barely enough to keep the wind out. The boat scraped against the rocky shore. The officers unloaded Baptiste. They left him with a few provisions, some bread, some water, perhaps a blanket. They did not leave him a weapon. They did not leave him a boat. As the officers pushed off, rowing back toward the world of the living, they looked back. Jean-Baptiste stood on the shoreline, a small, dark figure against the vast, gray emptiness of the lake. He was the king of his own private hell. He was surrounded by water that he could not drink, looking at a city he could never return to. He was 49 years old. He was alone. And he was supposed to die there. 3 weeks passed. The city of Salt Lake tried to heal. The sexton worked to restore order to the cemetery. The families tried to forget the image of the open graves. The name Jean-Baptiste began to fade, replaced by the silence of his exile. Then, the Miller brothers decided to check on their herd. They rowed out to Fremont Island. They expected to find a chastened, perhaps dying man. They expected to find Baptiste begging for salvation, or perhaps a frozen corpse huddled in the shack. What they found was a mystery that would outlive them all. The silence on the island was wrong. It was too absolute. They walked up the rise toward the shack. It was gone. Not gone, but consumed. The shack had been dismantled. The roof was missing. The siding had been stripped away. The sturdy timbers that formed the skeleton of the shelter had been pried loose. They rushed to the site. The ground was littered with debris. And then they saw the blood. A heifer, a young cow from their herd, lay slaughtered nearby. But it hadn't just been killed for meat. It had been skinned with the precision of a butcher or a gravedigger. The hide had been removed in large, intact sections. The brothers pieced together the forensic evidence of the escape. Baptiste hadn't just waited to die. He had engineered a miracle. He had used the timbers of the shack to build a frame. He had used the green, raw hide of the cow to lash the wood together. He utilized the shrinking property of drying leather to create bonds as tight as iron. He had built a raft. He had taken the provisions. He had taken the best cuts of meat. And he had launched himself into the great salt lake. The Miller brothers stood on the shore, scanning the water. There was nothing, no debris, no body, no raft. The Disappointment Island lived up to its name. The monster was gone. The implications were terrifying. Jean-Baptiste, the man who knew the faces of the dead, was loose. He was somewhere out there, on the mainland, invisible once again. Or he was at the bottom of the lake, his bones pickling in the brine, waiting to resurface. The hunt was supposed to be over. But as the brothers looked at the empty horizon, they realized the story had just twisted the knife. The abyss hadn't claimed Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste had navigated the abyss. Jean-Baptiste did not just disappear into the geography of Utah. He disappeared into its psychology. In the months following his escape from Fremont Island, a paranoia settled over the Salt Lake Valley like a winter inversion. The logic of the law said he was dead, drowned in the heavy, metallic waters of the Great Salt Lake, his homemade raft disintegrating under the strain of the waves. But the logic of fear said otherwise. Reports began to trickle in. A trapper claimed to see a small, dark man limping through the scrub near the Promontory Mountains. A mining camp in Montana spoke of a strange, silent Italian who knew too much about the anatomy of the dead. In the minds of the children of Salt Lake City, Baptiste became a boogeyman. If you stayed out too late, the ghoul would get you. If you didn't say your prayers, the man with the branded forehead would come for your shoes. Henry Heath, the man who had stared into the abyss of Baptiste's living room, grew old, carrying the weight of the unresolved case. He knew the forensic reality. The lake is a tomb that rarely gives up its dead. But he also knew the cunning of the man who had built a fleet of shoes from the grief of his neighbors. For 30 years, the story was a campfire tale, a legend, until the spring of 1893. The Jordan River twists through the valley, a sluggish artery connecting the fresh water of Utah Lake to the salt death of the Great Salt Lake. It is a place of reeds, mud, and secrets. In March of 1893, a group of duck hunters was pushing through the dense brush near the mouth of the river. The water was low. It exposed mud flats that had been submerged for years. One of the hunters spotted something white in the gray muck. It wasn't a stone. It was too smooth, too organic. They dug it out. It was a human skull. Intrigued and perhaps sensing a dark discovery, they kept digging. The mud surrendered its prize slowly, a rib cage, a pelvis, femurs. It was a man, or the architecture of one. But the horror was at the ankle. Clamped tight around the leg bone, rusted but unbroken, was an iron shackle. Attached to it was a heavy chain, and at the end of the chain, a solid iron ball. The press exploded. The Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News ran the headlines that everyone had been waiting for since the Civil War. Jean-Baptiste, found. The narrative fit perfectly. The exile, the escape, the drowning. The the weight of the iron ball dragging him down into the silt, holding him there while the flesh stripped away, leaving only the bones to tell the tale. It was a poetic end. The man who robbed the dead had been claimed by the dead, shackled by his own sins. But history, like a crime scene, is rarely clean. As the city celebrated the grim closure, the old guard stepped forward to ruin the ending. The men who had been there in 1862. Henry Heath and the other surviving officers were interviewed. They were adamant. They were under oath to their own memories. "We did not shackle him," Heath insisted. The exile was a punishment of isolation, not bondage. Baptiste had been left on the island as a free man in a prison of water. There were no chains in the boat. There was no ball in the shack. The discovery fractured into two impossible theories. Theory 1, the secret justice. The officers had lied. Perhaps in a moment of vigilante rage during that dark boat ride in 1862, they had shackled him. Maybe they threw him overboard themselves. The story of the raft was a fabrication to cover a police execution. Theory 2, the stranger. The skeleton in the mud wasn't Baptiste at all. It was some other poor wretch, a prisoner from a later era, a murder victim weighed down to hide the crime. His fate just happened to rhyme with the legend of the grave robber. If it was Baptiste, the shackle implies a darker end than exile. If it wasn't Baptiste, then the ghoul of Salt Lake City never died. He walked away. He lived. Today, the Salt Lake City Cemetery is a beautiful, serene place. It is a park of rolling hills and manicured lawns, overlooking the city that has grown into a metropolis. The graves of the pioneers are marked with sandstone and granite. Their inscriptions fade under the assault of time and smog. You can visit the grave of Officer Henry Heath, now resting in peace. But there is no stone for Jean-Baptiste. His legacy isn't in the ground. It is in the silence between the headstones. He is the shadow that reminds us that the line between the sacred and the profane is terrifyingly thin. He forced a community to look at the one thing they wanted to ignore, the physical reality of death. He stripped away the ritual and left only the cold, hard fact of the body. The abyss is not the Great Salt Lake. The abyss is the human capacity to rationalize horror. The city rationalized his exile as mercy. And we, the modern audience, rationalize our fascination as history. But when the wind blows off the lake, carrying the scent of brine and ancient decay, you can almost hear the rhythmic thud of a spade hitting wood. The grave robber is gone, but the grave remains open. We leave the story of Jean-Baptiste not with a period, but with an ellipsis. In the century and a half since the ghoul of Salt Lake vanished into the twilight, the Great Salt Lake has undergone its own slow, agonizing transformation. Today, the water levels are at historic lows. The lake is receding, pulling back from the shoreline like a dying tide, exposing vast stretches of white, cracked earth that haven't seen the sun since the days of Brigham Young. This environmental tragedy offers a final, chilling possibility for our story. The Great Salt Lake is a unique chemistry. It is a pickling jar. It does not decompose organic matter in the way a forest or a river does. It preserves it. The salt crusts over bone and leather, sealing them in a mineral tomb. If Jean-Baptiste drowned in 1862, if his cowhide raft waterlogged and dragged him down into the crushing depths, he is likely still down there. He would not be dust. He would be a statue of salt and gristle, waiting in the silt. As the waters continue to drop, exposing the secrets of the 19th century, we may yet stumble upon the final chapter of this mystery. We might find the rusted remnants of a shovel. We might find the tatters of a stolen shirt. Or we might find nothing at all. And perhaps that is the more terrifying answer. Because if the lake gives up its dead and Jean-Baptiste is not among them, then the old nursery rhymes were right. The monster didn't die in the deep water. the monster walked ashore, dried his clothes, and vanished into the crowd, an invisible man, wearing a suit he didn't pay for, walking among us, watching us bury our dead. That was Salt and Shadow, written and read by the author, me, James Cawley. I want to be clear about where the bones of this story come from. The case of Jean-Baptiste is a blend of hard judicial record and frontier folklore. The details of the initial discovery, the confrontation with Officer Henry Heath, and the 60 pairs of children's shoes are drawn from the historical record, specifically the journals of Henry Heath himself and the court records of Salt Lake City from 1862. The account of the exile to Fremont Island and the subsequent escape via the cowhide raft is documented in the historical works of authors like Hal Schindler. The discovery of the skeleton in 1893 is a matter of public record. The articles appeared in the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune in March of that year. The quotes regarding the denial of the shackles by the police officers are taken from those interviews. The branding of the forehead remains a point of debate among historians. Some claim it was a physical brand. Others claim it was a metaphorical mark of Cain. Jean-Baptiste was real. The robbery was real. And the empty island is a geographical fact. And somewhere, out there in the salt and brine of the lake, lies the truth. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. Not all stories of terror, horror, and dread come from fiction conjured in the mind and put to paper. Many of these stories come from the history that is all around us. Every week on this podcast, I'll present you with a new story, just like this one. Some coming from my archive of original fiction tales, and others, like this, are dredged from the depths of history, with sharp fingers still clutching the horrors of truth, humanity, and the darkness that walks amongst us. If you like stories like this, you're in the right place. I'll have another ready for you next week. Until next time, remember this. It's easy to forget the horrors of our past, to let names and actions fade into legend and myth, but the history we forget, it's not gone. It's just waiting up ahead to repeat itself once more.